Hey, I'm Brannen Bashum.
And I'm Jill Jacobs, and we're from Sprigley's Beescaping, which is a nature education and habitat restoration business located here in Waynesville. Today we're going to talk about boosting your backyard and supporting beneficial wildlife, and the steps you can take to support things like pollinators and other creatures that come to your space. The first thing to do when you're trying to design a landscape for native pollinators and other wildlife is to learn more about that wildlife and what they need in terms of overwintering, nesting, and forage for their habitat. Now, some of the most effective and efficient wildlife we have are pollinators, and for here in the States, our native bees are the best pollinators we have. Now, honeybees are not native. They were brought here by Europeans in the 1600s, and in the States, they brought them to a place that already had about 4,000 species of bees that we know of. Now, most of our bees are solitary. They live by themselves, they don't live in a large hive like a honeybee, and they do not cooperate any labor. So they really just provision their own nest, and they can't forage much more than about 100 yards from where they are. And that's the case for a lot of our native creatures. So if they don't have water, food, nesting sites, habitat, forage all in one location, they can easily perish. Now, there's other creatures too, such as moths and butterflies, bats, beetles, flies, ants, all sorts of creatures that are indispensable cogs in our ecosystem. And by doing some quick, simple things, you can really help them thrive in your own garden. Now, one of the best ways to do that is by leaving spaces wild. One of the best ways to support native wildlife is to let spaces be wild. Now, when you're rewilding a space, you want to be careful not to let invasive plants try to take over those native plants as they're establishing. However, letting native plants thrive is not the only thing you need to do to make sure you have the right habitat. One of the key habitat that our pollinator needs are logs, fallen logs and dead trees, which serve as nesting sites and overwintering sites for a whole slew of wildlife. Creatures like mason bees and leafcutter bees use the holes that have already been bored by beetle larvae inside to create their nests. So it's a very important ecosystem to have. So leave them where they fall. Another thing you should leave where they fall are leaves. Leaving the leaves is an essential part of overwintering for all different types of wildlife. Creatures like wasps and moths and butterflies, and also the bumblebee, need leaf litter as essential overwintering habitat. Bumblebees, for example, at the end of the season, the whole entire nest, which is about 100 bees, they are a social species, one of our only ones in the States, will die off. Before they do, they produce a brand new young queen who goes out and finds an area with leaf litter that she can burrow under and then into the soil so she can overwinter. She produces glucose, which she pumps through her veins as a type of antifreeze, and stays under that leaf litter until the spring, where she comes out and starts her own nest. Now, during the growing season, something that you want to make sure you remember is to leave areas of bare soil. About 70% of our native bees and a lot of our other native insects live inside the soil and need that access with not a lot of mulch and other things on top of it. If you have a more manicured area and you can't just leave those bare areas of soil, consider leaving some sparse mulch around the base of your plants and also behind larger plants where they can't be seen by humans, but the pollinators in your area will really thank you for having them there. Now, the last thing that's extremely important is to not be afraid of pests. Traditional pests like aphids can actually be really fantastic at bringing predators to your garden that can take care of the aphid problem and also provide other free pest control. Those are creatures like hoverflies and beetles and wasps who will be the best thing to take care of any pest problem you might have. We always like to say that for every pest, there is a predator that's better than a pesticide.
Now, even though a traditional turf grass lawn looks pleasing to our eyes, unfortunately those same lawns are unappealing and downright dangerous to pollinators and other beneficial wildlife that attempt to pass through them. Now this is because, important to keep in mind, that turf grass is actually a non-native species in most of the US, and so those plantings are huge monocultures or single species areas of low-lying grasses that don't offer much in the way of forage or protection for insects and other wildlife. Now, studies are actually starting to show that by planting a pollinator pathway through your turfgrass lawn, such as native plants, shrubs, and wildflowers, can actually help those insects and other beneficial wildlife travel through their lawn as they're going from natural place to natural place. Now, studies have actually found that native plantings in a turfgrass area can increase the amount of species in that area by about 15%. So it's very possible to make huge differences in the wildlife you see in and around your garden just by planting some native plants around your turfgrass area. Now, as you can see behind me, this is what we like to call a naturalized lawn. Now, this is a lawn that we stopped cutting about 4 years ago, and basically we let all of the native plants that had seeds already in the seed bank here come up on their own. And so as you can see, there are a wide variety of different levels in the plants in this lawn, and so you can imagine insects, birds, even larger wildlife like opossums find it much easier to travel through an area like this and find shelter if they do encounter predators on their way. And now, interestingly, a recent study has also showed that landscapes require at least 70% native plants to be able to support enough insects to feed insect-eating birds like chickadees. And actually, the study found that once a landscape dropped below 70% native plants in that landscape, chickadees and other insect-eating birds had to move on because there simply weren't enough insects in that landscape to support those animals. And that's just another great example of how many of our beneficial insects are closely tied to those plants that they've lived around for, again, hundreds of millions of years. And so when you're planting, also try to plant your plants in dense collections of similar plants together. I like to plant at least 3 plants right next to each other. What that does is it creates more of a bullseye in your landscape for any beneficial wildlife that are passing through to both see and or smell those plants, rather than planting singular plants kind of polka dotted throughout your landscape. Grouping similar plants together just makes it easier for beneficial wildlife passing through to see and approach those plantings. Now, one last thing I'll leave you with as you begin your wildlife gardening journey is stop using pesticides whenever and wherever possible. Now, studies are starting to show that even seemingly benign pesticides like herbicides and fungicides can actually combine with each other inside of the bodies of animals that have come into contact with them outside in the field. And those pesticides can actually turn into more harmful forms of themselves once they've been combined with other pesticides inside that animal's body. Now, a lot of studies have recently been done on bumblebees, for example, one of our few social bees here in the States. And unfortunately, studies are showing that even if those bees are introduced to herbicides at a rate that does not kill them, known as a sublethal effect, those kind of pesticide interactions inside of their bodies are enough to harm and damage their brains to the extent that they forget skills learned throughout their lives, and their foraging behavior is altered and, in the long run, very severely hampered by being introduced to those pesticides. The soil underneath our feet is probably the most diverse ecosystem known to man. There are trillions of microbes in a square inch of soil. And now, unfortunately, studies are showing that some of the common herbicides and other pesticides wantonly sprayed by most homeowners are doing extreme damage to those microbes as well, which hampers actually their ability to transform nutrients in the air into usable forms for plants, And also, there's a wide variety of other microbes that downright attach and help plant roots absorb water and collect nutrients as well. And so, science is starting to show that pesticides are having some long-reaching effects onto those microbes. And those effects will slowly start to be seen as they work their way up the table into larger and more complex organisms. And so I encourage you to look for other ways to control pests and diseases in your garden and use pesticides as a last resort rather than a first choice. Disease-prone areas and plants, especially those that get powdery mildew and other fungi, is make sure that you thin those plants out in early summer. Thinning them out allows for more airflow to travel between those plants and will greatly reduce the amount of fungal buildups you see. What I like to do, especially in clumps of plants like, say, goldenrod or sunflowers where they grow very close together, I like to trim out those plants so there's enough space to fit my fist in between each plant. Usually that's thinning out for every plant, you're thinning 2 or 3 plants around it. So again, by eliminating those pesticides, you will actually find that you're creating a much more robust and self-sufficient ecosystem than by taking the easy way out and simply spraying and forgetting. Thank you for spending some time with us today. I hope you learned a little bit about making your space a little bit more livable for wildlife in your area.
And if you want to learn more about creating wild spaces, explore more information about pollinators, or just keep learning about the wonderful world around us, please check out our website at spriglies.com or find us on Facebook or Instagram at Spriglies Beescaping. Thanks so much.